Hey guys, welcome back to Checkerboard Chat, the official sports podcast of the Daily Beacon. I'm Blake Von Hagen, he's Will Backus, and we're here to recap Tennessee's loss to number 1 Alabama and preview Tennessee's game against South Carolina. Well, we're filming a little later in the week this time. It's a Thursday, so we've had time to each go to a Jeremy Pruitt press conference. We've had time to talk to players. What's the vibe you've got out of them from that Alabama game?
I think they're kind of brushing it off. I don't want to say that they were expecting that, but it's kind of one of those games where I feel like maybe they knew that they thought they had a chance, but it might have been one where they knew, if we lose this game, then it's kind of, water under the bridge. They don't seem to be taking it too hard. A couple of them said that it was kind of hard to get over it just because it was such a big loss, but they seem to be pretty focused and honed in on moving on to South Carolina, which is a pretty big game because it's one of those winnable games through the last 5 that might propel them into the postseason.
Yeah, nothing says dream crusher coming off a win against Auburn on the road like a meeting with Nick Saban Alabama team, especially this Alabama team who might be the best team he's had as a head coach at Alabama. 58-21 win against Tennessee, and it was never really close. Alabama jumps out to that lead in the beginning, and we talked about it going into the game. They've been notorious for getting out to hot starts this season. They've covered the spread in the first half every game this season. That continued on Saturday, and they were just making plays all over the field, offense, defense, and Tennessee wasn't really able to get anything going.
No, Alabama came out and dominated. They scored 3 touchdowns in 4 minutes and 40 seconds, and about 4 minutes of that drive was on their first drive. And then they score a touchdown on their first drive. Tennessee comes out and they immediately fumble the ball away to Alabama in the red zone. And then Alabama scores another touchdown. And then Tennessee comes out and they go quick 3 and out. And then Alabama scores on a one-play 77-yard touchdown. So then in the first quarter, they jump out to a 21-0 lead. And there's pretty much, I don't think, a team in the country that could come back from that kind of deficit to Alabama. So it was just kind of a really tough game for Tennessee. Like you said, it was a big dream crusher coming off of Auburn because they finally got that big SEC win. They got a big win that gave them a lot of momentum, and then that momentum was kind of halted against Alabama. But I feel like, they might have we'll see if they've done a good job of brushing it off or if they come out against South Carolina and play slowly. Slow starts have kind of plagued them this year. I believe they've been outscored in the first quarter 69-16 so far this season. And it doesn't help when Alabama scores 21 points on you and you don't score anything in the first quarter. But slow starts have been kind of a theme for Tennessee football teams for as long as I can remember. And it seems like this team is kind of carrying on that tradition.
Yeah, and like you said, I got the same vibe from the players when we talked to them. I went on Monday, and then you were there on Tuesday, but they all seem to kind of be brushing it off, like you said, and I think that's the only thing you can do after that game. There's no reason. Obviously, you look at it, you see what you did wrong, but it's Alabama, and South Carolina is not Alabama, so they've got that going for them this week, but you can't look at that too closely or you're just going to overanalyze everything. And one thing we do need to talk about is starting quarterback Jarrett Guarantano. He was knocked out of the game against Alabama in the second quarter. He took a hit from Mack Wilson. Jeremy Pruitt said that he should be good to go on Saturday. And then, leading off of that, Keller Chris came in the game, and he actually looked pretty good for Tennessee. I don't know if there's a quarterback controversy because Guarantano, obviously, with that win against Auburn, he led the team in that game. But Chris looked sharp. I think he was 9 of 15. He threw 2 touchdowns, and he made a couple of plays where Tennessee got behind the Alabama secondary, and maybe Alabama doesn't have the same focus when they're up so many points at that point in the game, but he did look good, and Tennessee has that option if Guarantano can't go, but it sounds like he'll be able to go.
It does sound like he'll be able to go against South Carolina. The specific injury that he suffered is up in the air. It's been, some people say collarbone, some people say bruised ribs. It hasn't ever been confirmed by Pruitt himself. All Pruitt said was that he should be good to go against South Carolina. Even so, he may not be 100%. We've seen situations like last season when Guarantano had an ankle injury that he tried to play while hurt, and it ended up, kind of limiting his ability. So we'll see if that happens against South Carolina. It wouldn't be surprising if we saw Christ play, more than just the garbage time that he's used to. And that may not be a bad thing for Tennessee because you did mention the good game Christ had. You mentioned, the couple touchdowns. He did look good on his throws, but I think what was helping Christ was the fact that Alabama probably wasn't able to scout him too efficiently. They could only really see what he had done when Tennessee was down by a lot or up by a lot, and most of those were just handoffs. He did play a pretty decent amount against West Virginia. And he didn't throw a whole lot in that game, but he did have one 50-yard touchdown pass. I believe it was in that game to Jordan Murphy, or it might have been ETSU. But other than that, Alabama didn't have a whole lot of scouting to work with. And Nick Saban even said after the game himself that a lot of the reason Gilchrist was successful was because they weren't really able to prepare for that outcome too well. So I think what aided Christ in his performance was the fact that there wasn't a lot to scout on him. And we'll see if he plays against South Carolina, if he's able to perform to that, because he gives South Carolina some new looks. We'll see if he's able to kind of live up to that little bit of hype he built against Alabama now that South Carolina has gotten at least a taste of what a Christ-run Tennessee offense will look like.
Yeah, but I don't think either of us expect him to play in that game unless, one team's ahead by a lot, which is not likely looking at it. South Carolina, 7.5-point favorite right now, so not expected to be a game where either team is up by 2 or 3 touchdowns, which is where we would expect Chris to come in, unless somehow Garantano can't play, which wouldn't be all that surprising with how Pruitt has kind of kept things under the table this season with injuries and things like that. He really just hasn't mentioned it. He says he'll likely be good to go. So all we can expect is Garantano to be playing, and we might see Chris, but likely not. And Garantano is probably what we should focus on there. But looking back on the Alabama game, just to recap, there wasn't even really a position group that stood out. A lot of positives from that game. I'd say the wide receivers probably they didn't have a whole lot of drop passes in that game, but across the board, special teams have been something that Tennessee's done well in every game pretty much this season, and even special teams. You've got Ty Chandler with an illegal fair catch as he makes a fair catch after he catches the ball, which is not how that works. So that was the ball was spotted inside the 5-yard line to start the second half. Pruitt not happy about that one, and then even Joe Doyle shanked the punt, which we haven't seen him do this year.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a good game all around for Tennessee. You mentioned wide receivers. I think they've been the consistently best position group, which is kind of a different feel than last season, because last season Tennessee's wide receivers struggled to perform a bit. But they have done a pretty decent job this year of staying consistent. They win a lot of 50-50 catches. There's not a lot of passes on the ground that shouldn't be. So they've done consistently well, but at the same time, some certain position groups have regressed, like the running game. It got off to a pretty hot start. Ty Chandler had, I think it was like a 150-yard game at one point, and now they're just struggling to get any production as they face these bigger defensive fronts in the SEC, like Alabama and like Auburn. They can't even really total 100 yards. I believe Tennessee had negative yards after the first quarter in net rushing. So the run game continues to regress. And another position group that has just kind of been inconsistent the whole year is the offensive line. We thought they were getting better because they did a pretty good job against Georgia, and then they did a decent job, at least in pass protection, against Auburn. But then they come out in the Alabama game and they get dominated. I think Garantano got hit on pretty much each of their first 3 snaps in their first drive, and he got consistently hit throughout the day. When Killer Chris came back in, they did a little bit of a better job of protecting him. That might have been those different looks that we talked about. But the offensive line is definitely going to have to really, really, really pick it up and kind of get back to what we saw for a brief little bit against Georgia if Tennessee is going to, have any success in the next 5 games and if they have a hope of making the bowl game. And the running game is going to have to step up too, but that's, that again kind of falls on the offensive line, because the line is allowing a lot of interior defensive linemen to get back there and pop the running backs before they can get into space or try to make a move. So it's just there's a couple things that Tennessee really needs to clean up moving forward.
Yeah, and I think the offensive line definitely benefited from a soft coverage from Alabama as that game went along. And, Nick Saban's known for not wanting to really lay it down on his former assistant coaches. When they're a head coach, he kind of eases off the gas pedal there, and I think we saw a little bit of that, even though they still won 58-21. It could have been worse than that if Nick Saban wanted it to be worse than that. So now looking ahead to the South Carolina game, you talked about the Tennessee's rushing offense, and it's a decent matchup because South Carolina doesn't have a great run defense. They don't have a great pass defense either. If you look at it, both teams are in the 60s in overall defense. I think South Carolina maybe 63rd and Tennessee 68th. It's something around there. So both teams pretty similar there offensively. They're both around the same too. So on paper, it's pretty even matchup statistically. South Carolina, I think Tennessee catches South Carolina at a decent spot here because South Carolina they were wanting to compete for the SEC East this year, at least second place behind Georgia. Now Florida and Kentucky both ahead of them. They're 3-3. They had a crazy win over Missouri. I don't know if you watched that game where it was just a monsoon. They pulled that one out, but then they lost to Kentucky. Got blown out by Georgia. It was only, I think, 4 points different than the Tennessee score against Georgia, so both teams fared pretty similarly in that one, although South Carolina was at home in that game. And then they beat Vanderbilt in a blowout win. Vanderbilt has not looked great this season. So on paper, Tennessee and South Carolina, pretty even matchup.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a very winnable game for Tennessee. South Carolina is down. Like you mentioned, they had such high expectations in the preseason. I believe they were ranked top 25, and if not, I know they have been at some point this season. They just had high expectations. A lot of people, at least expected them to be competitive in the SEC East and finish second behind Georgia, or maybe even compete with Georgia. I even pegged them as the one team in the SEC East that had a chance against Georgia before the season. But we've seen teams like Florida and Kentucky, kind of hop over them, which was very surprising. So South Carolina hasn't lived up to their expectations yet, and Tennessee does catch them at an interesting time after, the kind of skid they went on. They did have a bye week this past week, so that might help their chances, and it's at home, which is why I think South Carolina ultimately gets the edge. But I think it's going to be, a pretty close game. Like you said, on paper, they're a pretty well even matchup. South Carolina has Jake Bentley, who's a good quarterback, but he's struggled a lot this season. He's kind of regressed. And at the same time, Tennessee has a quarterback situation with, Jarrett Garantano that may not be completely healthy, and Keller Christ, who has been, inconsistent at best at times this season, who might have a hot hand. So it'll be a very interesting matchup to watch. You did mention both defenses. I think South Carolina has one of the worst rush defenses in the SEC, so that might be a good opportunity for Tennessee's run game to pick up the pace and try to kind of establish themselves early and often, because I know that's what offensive coordinator Tyson Helton wants to do. He's mentioned many times that he wants to, bleed the clock and pound the ball. So Tennessee might have a good chance to do that against a pretty weak South Carolina defensive front that's not great against the run, and that might open up some passes later in the game for either Garantano or Chris. But it'll be an even matchup. It'll be close. They're pretty similar teams.
Yeah, Jake Bentley having a career low in passing this season. It's his third season, so teams, they got 2 years of film to look at, and I think that's probably hurting him a little bit. Maybe not as many options at wide receiver, although he does have Deboe Samuel, one of the best wide receivers in the SEC. But yeah, he's having a career low in passing. And then talked about the home field advantage. Last year, I think in college football, home field attendance was down, or attendance in college football was down 4% overall. South Carolina was actually up 2%, so their home field has been good for them. It only holds around 80,000, but they get that place really loud, and it's kind of a sneaky tough place to play in the realm of college football. But this year, I don't know what the attendance will be like. It is a night game, so that usually helps attendance. But with them being 3-3, things aren't where they wanted it to be. I don't know if that will hurt fan attendance on Saturday. That's something to look at.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tennessee's players are expecting a relatively hostile environment. They were asked about it a couple times on Tuesday, and they said that they're excited to play there. Last time Tennessee was at South Carolina, it didn't really go too well for them. That was a season, Tennessee had really high expectations. They were expected to, come out and win the East, and the South Carolina game was kind of, a really big letdown game for them, and they were at South Carolina. So a lot of these juniors and seniors on the team have that experience. So a lot of them are pretty emotional about returning. They want, they kind of want revenge on that loss. So it'll be a fun game. I do expect there to be a pretty good crowd because it's a night game, and South Carolina seems to do a good job of maybe not filling their stadium but getting excited for games. So it'll be definitely a pretty tough environment for Tennessee, which is a team that has fared pretty decently on the road this year.
Yeah, they have, and that's been a strength for Tennessee. But yeah, going back to that 2016 game, a 15-9 win for South Carolina. That was Tennessee's third straight loss. That knocked them out of the top 25, and that kind of spiraled into that season, that 2016 season. That was a huge loss for Tennessee. And then last year, South Carolina comes to Neyland and wins another close game. I think the last 6 games have come down to one possession between these two teams. And then Will Muschamp, their head coach, he's 6-0 against Tennessee in his career, dating back to his days at Florida and then at South Carolina. So he has Tennessee's number right now. Tennessee's only surpassed 300 yards on offense once against Will Muschamp, so that's something to look at with Tennessee having offensive struggles already this year and then historically have not fared well against Muschamp. They'll need to do better this season if they want to knock off South Carolina.
Right, and as you mentioned, South Carolina does kind of have a lot of mental edges, and it is a very close game. It's always kind of one of those games that kind of sneaks up on you in the schedule that no matter how good or bad the teams are, it'll always be a close game because we had, in I believe it was Butch Jones's first season, South Carolina was ranked number 11, and they come into Neyland Stadium, and Tennessee beats them off of a last-minute field goal. So it's always going to be a pretty even matchup. I don't expect a blowout just because of how history, what the matchup has shown us in the past. And you mentioned the Will Muschamp streak. It's a pretty fun stat. A lot of Tennessee fans aren't happy about it because Will Muschamp, no matter how inferior his teams may have seen, has always found a way to get the advantage on Tennessee. And with both guys being former Saban assistants, it might be a fun matchup to watch there.
Yeah, so South Carolina's 7.5-point favorite as it stands right now. Who do you have in the game?
I think South Carolina wins. Like we said before, they're evenly matched teams, but South Carolina has the home field advantage. And, there's that Will Muschamp factor, which I don't know how big of a factor that will play because of the new head coaching staff. But I think the home field advantage really kind of propels South Carolina to a victory over Tennessee. It'll be a very close game. I think South Carolina wins somewhere in the ballpark of 27-21. I don't think they cover that spread, but I do think they win.
Yeah, I'm going to go South Carolina too. I said 28-13, so a little more than you. I just think Tennessee's secondary, it's had struggles this year, and Jake Bentley, there's nothing better to get him kind of off his schneid than a matchup with a bad secondary. And he's faced some pretty good secondaries this year. He also had to play in that monsoon, like we mentioned, so that might be hurting his numbers a little bit. They had the bye week to prepare for this game, so more film to look at. Tennessee has to go play against Alabama, maybe beat up a little bit after that game with how physical Alabama plays, and then Garantano, we don't know exactly if he'll be 100% or not. So I think some signs pointing to South Carolina here. They've got the home field advantage. They play really well at home outside of that Georgia game, obviously, this season, but I think this is a chance for South Carolina to kind of start turning their season around. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen in this game against Tennessee. So I think almost it's either Tennessee wins outright or South Carolina wins by a couple touchdowns. That's kind of how I'm looking at it. So I'm going to go South Carolina as well. But as we wrap this thing up, take a look at some of the other Tennessee sports that are going on right now. The volleyball team won again yesterday, Wednesday night against South Carolina at home. They're now 8-2 in the SEC, and they're looking to make their first NCAA tournament since 2012.
Yeah, they're on a roll right now. They've won 3 games in a row. They're tied for 3rd in the SEC with Missouri. They're pretty much continuing to exceed all preseason expectations. They're pretty close to getting, their first top 25 ranking in a pretty long time. South Carolina and Tennessee were both volleyball teams that were on the bubble, and some people saw this as kind of a matchup that would propel one of them into the top 25. So when those new rankings come out, we'll see if the volleyball team is ranked. But Eve Rackham has them going the right direction in her first year.
Yeah, and Tennessee took it in straight sets too, which is something to note. Seems like this team has a tendency when they get out in front to kind of put their foot on the pedal and really finish things off. They've had a couple straight set victories in SEC play. And then looking at Tennessee soccer, which is also going on right now, they have senior night tonight against Missouri. They're trying to finish off the season strong. They got Bunny Shaw back from her stint with the Jamaican national team, so they're looking to push ahead into SEC tournament play and then NCAA tournament play.
Right, they're coming off a big road win against number 5 Texas A&M. They beat them 4-0, so that's a huge momentum builder, especially after they had dropped a few matches and tied in a few matches that a lot of that people thought they should have been able to win or that they should have even won outright. So to have that win under their belts, now I think they're back in the top 10, top 15 range. I think they're number 8 in one of the polls. So they've got momentum back on their side. Like you said, tonight's senior night, so it's an emotional night. So they're going to look to cap off, the regular, or as the regular season winds down, they're going to look to get a win over Missouri and then look ahead to postseason play.
Yeah, and then some of the other sports happening right now. Swim and dive team has their first regular season meet today, and then they swim again tomorrow. You've got the tennis teams playing right now. Timo Stoddard won the Ohio Valley Regional Championship here, hosted in Knoxville a few weeks ago. And then The women's tennis team is here this weekend. The track and field team is going to the SEC championships this weekend. So lots of action with Tennessee sports. We've got basketball coming up. Lady Vols Media Day is today. So look for coverage of Lady Vols Media Day. And then the men's team will open up the season next week. So lots of things happening right now around Tennessee.
Right. We're about to get really busy.
Yeah, we are. So we'll be in South Carolina on Saturday night. We'll have articles and recaps of that game. And then we'll have basketball starting next week. So for now, thanks for watching.